we'll kick things off. Our webinar today is entitled Don't Fear OSHA Audits, the 5 Must-Dos of Rack Safety. I'm Mark Rousseau. I'll be today's speaker. I head up the national accounts team for Damotech. Been with the company going on 10 years now. So I look forward to sharing some of our insights on how to prepare yourself with some key ideas and some takeaways that'll hopefully be beneficial for your organizations. So we talked about OSHA. It's I would say somewhat of a 4-letter word that has I guess different impressions for folks. For those that have not been through an OSHA inspection or a no-knock, I think you can. It's not something that we want to necessarily have to look forward to, but nevertheless, I think it's an important aspect of the safety culture that we have in the U.S. Fundamentally, all governments and companies require that employers maintain a safe working environment. That's kind of that general clause that ensures that we're doing the right thing for the employees that work within the facilities that we manage. A couple years ago, OSHA launched a national emphasis program. It's called the NEP, and they did that specifically for warehousing and distribution sectors because they found that the incident rate was almost twice as high as other industries. So warehousing and storage has proven to be a segment of the workplace where we're seeing more injuries than others, and that's caused um, uh, OSHA to launch this initiative, which allows them a lot more freedom and liberties as they, potentially are called on to your site for other reasons. I mean, they could very well have been called for an issue with the means of egress. Maybe one of the employees at your site or at a particular site saw boxes that were stacked by the fire exit, and they were concerned that they wouldn't be able to exit freely should there be a need to do so. So OSHA would get called, and the complaint would be filed, and they would send an inspector. And it used to be they would have to kind of walk that straight line and address the issue at hand. But with the NEP, with the National Emphasis Program, they're now allowed legally to pivot and go and take a look at the racking to see if there are any issues with it. So how that impacts your workplace. So the inspection from OSHA can be a programmed one, so it's a planned one that maybe as part of a regional emphasis. It could be driven by complaints, like the example that I just gave, and of course, it could be paired with other hazards. Which again, going to the means of egress example that I just provided, they would be able to take a look at your racking and look out for things that might be that may not be in keeping with code, whether that's a lack of load capacities or damage to the racking, things that we'll cover throughout today's presentation. The idea being we should look to act now and be prepared because it's just a matter of time when OSHA is going to have to, show up at one of our facilities. So more and more facilities are mandating rack safety. So in many instances, it's not just OSHA that's kind of being the forcing function throughout the organization or throughout the network. We want to make sure that as we make our way through this, that you have the tools and the resources to navigate through what those OSHA demands could be, and to the extent you have corporate policies or other forcing functions within your organizations that require an emphasis on racking. We'll make sure that you're compliant so that you avoid whether it's not meeting your own guidelines or that you're well prepared for the eventual OSHA visit. So why does rack safety matter? Well, we're looking to protect employees. We're looking to protect the inventory and our operations. That's kind of the fundamentals behind it. And there are real costs associated with rack safety. To the extent the racking is put out of service, well, there's downtime. There are certainly potential fines that could be levied. And there could be injuries or reputation damage if something really, really bad were to happen to the rack and cause injury or even potentially death. So the five must-dos to reinforce warehouse safety. Let's kick things off with the first one. Scheduling regular inspections. And this is an important one. It's one that we always lead off with because the idea of having an inspection, whether it's self-performed or it's having a third-party expert come in, it gives you a baseline and a full understanding of what's going on with your racking. Now, it's important to note that racks are highly efficient structures. I mean, these are components that were designed by engineers and folks with decades in the industry, and the idea being they're predominantly meant to support vertical loads. So to the extent that a racking manufacturer can use 10, 15% less steel in the racking design, yet still be able to support the same amount of weight, to them is a good thing, and to you also in a way, because as everything is priced per pounds, you're going to pay less for that racking. But what's not kind of always considered when we save money on the racking, or the racking is designed to use less steel, is that inevitably racking damage will take place. So if you look at the examples that we have on our screen, these are examples that we have from customer interactions, from inspections of our own. And the idea behind these pictures is that damage like this isn't meant to happen, right? The racking was not designed with impact or damage like you're seeing on the screen as part of its structural integrity. So none of these things were anticipated when the racking was designed. And the reason why we are concerned about those kinds of damages, and if we don't act on those issues, we have what we see on the screen now. Now, we don't put these up to scare folks, but I often, as we do these webinars or I present in person to various customers, inevitably there's a gasp from looking at some of these images, because this is what happens if racking damage is ignored, or if we're complacent about addressing the issues that could be present, within the racking in the warehouse. So rack damage, I showed a couple examples there. Is a collapse imminent? How do we know if the damage that we have or that our racking has sustained will lead to a collapse? We just don't know. I mean, we have enough experience to know that the damage is significant, but I can't tell you that after 10 years, will the racking let go the next day, a week later, 2 months later? It's awfully difficult to be able to ascertain that. So that's why we take the conservative approach of saying, look, no rack damage is good, and we should get ahead of it before something does happen. Now, here are some videos of some rack collapses. You can see that this kind of just happened out of nowhere. I mean, there's no activity going on. Could there have been a dislodged beam that led to some of this, letting go? Absolutely. And sometimes it doesn't have to be a big impact. Here's an instance where a minor impact barely brush up against the upright, and because the upright has sustained damage already, it was already weakened. So that small tap of that forklift is enough to cause this all to kind of come toppling down. Now, this other one made the rounds on YouTube, and we're not helping the situation here by putting floor stack materials, but a small tap of a 5,000-pound forklift is enough to cause all of these things to come tumbling down. And the way this racking is designed, as we get higher in height and we're trying to maintain the integrity of the system, we're tying all this racking together. So we're going to back-to-back situations with row spacers. We're doing top ties. all of that leads to, the racking, coming down section by section. Here's one with a seismic event where the racking simply wasn't designed for the geography that it was in. It should have been able to sustain this seismic event where we're seeing that it was not able to. So it shakes a little bit and the components simply just fail and it causes a collapse. So with that, we kind of lead into, the seismic hazards that are present in the U.S. And, everybody focuses, and rightly so, on the West Coast because that's where we have, the highest seismic zones and seismic areas. But if you look, I'll call it Midwest of the country, in the Tennessee area, you've got some strong red, and in those areas are prone to seismic concerns. So this is all to say, thinking back to the video we just played about that racking kind of letting go during a seismic event. We have to ensure that the racking that we have in these areas that could be more prone to seismic events to be designed accordingly. So, kind of food for thought. We've inspected over the years. And this data is about 12 years old. So we've inspected north of 1 billion square feet of warehouse space, and in our experience, most warehouses will have 10% of their racking bays have some form of high priority issue. And up to half of these must be unloaded immediately. Again, that's from data that we've collected over time inspecting warehouses that are, more than 3 years old. In some cases, they're more than 20 years old, and then they've never been looked after. So for sure, if it's been a couple decades since someone has put eyeballs on the racking, most definitely you will have more than 10% of your racking have some form of high priority issue that should be looked after. So how often should racking be inspected? There's four choices. Monthly, yearly, it's been done, but a long time ago and never. I'm going to launch a quick poll, and I'll ask everybody to kind of take a few seconds just to answer, and we'll talk about the results of this. Again, how often should racks be inspected? So 76% of you answered that the rack should be inspected monthly. 15% of you said yearly. 9% of you said it's been done, but a long time ago. And of course, good news, none of you or 0% of the attendees said never. So that was really great. So thank you for that. Now, as we keep on going, the answer to this is one of it depends, which our chief engineer is very fond of saying when we ask him a question about engineering around racking. He says, "What do you think, Charles?" I'll often answer with "it depends," and I would tell you that the frequency and who or whom should be inspecting your rack will depend on the type of environment that you're working in. So annual inspections are strongly encouraged by the industry. There's no code that'll stipulate the frequency, but there's always like a general nudge towards saying you should have somebody with expertise, a third party, hopefully an engineering firm that can come in and take a look at the racking on an annual basis just to make sure that all of the small things have been looked after. Monthly inspections, and this is very common with many of the national accounts that we serve today. Those monthly inspections are being done by their own trained warehouse employees or folks that maybe have gone through a Damotech training situation, or they've been trained otherwise. But a monthly inspection by somebody at the facility level would be a great idea. Weekly, certainly there's some areas of the warehouse which are more prone to damage. So example, your shipping and receiving areas where there's a lot of traffic, a lot of velocity going through, those might want to have a more frequent inspection. And there may be some areas like ends of aisles or certain freezer departments where you'll want to have a daily inspection. Just maybe you have, 50 or 100 bays of racking that you could quickly just have a quick view of to make sure there wasn't any significant impact that hadn't been reported already. And the things we want to look for Clearly we want to look for the presence of load capacity labels or placards. Are those there? Because that's a very binary thing that OSHA will look for. You'll hear me talk about OSHA a lot throughout the presentation. It's a big focus of what we're talking about today. But that's one of the key things that OSHA looks for, and I'll be talking about here a lot more as we make our way through the presentation. You want to look at the uprights, the columns and the braces. So the uprights being those vertical members, and the bracing being the metal component that's usually welded. Sometimes it's bolted to connect the front and rear columns of the upright to provide it some stability. Then, of course, the beams, which is a horizontal component that supports the pallets. And sometimes we'll see safety bars present or wire mesh decking. So things we'll take a look at. Now, when to inspect. Here are five, I would say very, very common situations when we'll want to have somebody come in to inspect. If there's incomplete documentation, if you don't have load capacity and LARCs for your racking, so a load application and a rack configuration drawing. So if you don't have that documentation, you're required to by the building code to have it. So that's a good time to call in an expert to assess what those capacities could be. If you reconfigured the racking, if you've had a new installation of racking, maybe it's racking that you had left over from another site that you're now going to add and expand for an existing warehouse. You'll want to have that inspected and to make sure that it's in keeping with what the code requires. If there's been an accident, clearly, if you went through one of those situations that I saw that we showed on the video, you'll want to have somebody come in. And maybe you've been through a seismic event. We've been called upon more times than I can count after even a small seismic event in California to come in and just put our eyes on the racking to make sure that the welds held, that the racking is still plumb, that it behaved the way it was supposed to throughout that seismic event. So if you have one of those take place, you'll want to have an expert come out to take a look. Clearly, if you've had OSHA come in, if you have the unfortunate luck to have OSHA come in, you'll want to bring in an expert to partner with you to make sure that you have what's needed to answer OSHA, put a plan together and to address the concerns that they maybe have highlighted already. And to the extent maybe you have a corporate safety initiative, there's performance benchmarking across the network of DCs or warehouses in your company, and they're looking to see if there are some regional concerns. So you'll want to have somebody come in to do that. So we've talked about inspections quite a bit, and I think it goes without saying that inspection from the get-go, especially an annual one, it's meant to be independent. It's meant to have somebody with no other desire but to impart their expert knowledge to ensure that you're meeting code. So it's often called a third-party audit. It really is meant to see if the racking as it sits and stands there today, if it's conforming to the codes and standards. We happen to have trained engineers perform the inspections that we do. So we would advise that that's a recommended thing, but of course there are plenty of companies out there that have trusted professionals that I'm sure can do a great job. We happen to think that if you're going to bring an expert in once a year, it should be somebody that's got a lot of deep knowledge on the engineering of the rack so that they could address the issues that they might find and keep the context of the situation in mind. Of course, you'll want to have a detailed report. Of course, some key findings and recommendations are always a key thing. So the inspections that we do or that a professional should be doing involve a multitude of different elements. I think we do something like north of 45 or 50 different items as part of our overall checklist of things. So as you make our way through the slide, starting in the top left, we'll certainly look at damage to the upright. We'll look at whether there's some buckling that's present. Is the racking plumb? Is it vertical? Is it leaning front to back, or is it leaning down aisle because maybe it's a slope, that you have in the warehouse, or maybe there's outdoor racking. But you'll still want to ensure, even though there might be a slight change in gradient, to have that racking be plumb. Is there an adequate clearance with building structures? Because the code talks about that. Beam deflections. Is there a deflection in the beam? Is the beam damaged? And if there is a deflection in the beam, is it one that's persistent? In other words, once you remove the freight, does it bounce back or does it stay permanently deformed? Because the code allows for some amount of deflection, but not too much. So you'll want an engineer and someone with experience to be able to say whether the deflection that we're noticing is significant enough for you to have to change the component or address it otherwise. Uh, Falling objects. If you have racking where the backside of the rack, leads to a pedestrian walkway, do you have netting or other safeguards in place to prevent product from toppling over were it to be pushed by machinery? Again, we talked about load capacities. Are there larks? Do you have the capacities and stamp drawings that go with it? And look, maybe on the other side of things, is there rust? Do you have outdoor racking, and is it rusted? And if it is rusted, is it to a point where we're concerned that the integrity of the racking is compromised? Maybe you're in a caustic environment. Maybe you have liquids that are stored and that leak occasionally. So you'll want to check those kinds of things. And welded repairs. Look for welded repairs. I mean, our engineer inspectors will have a keen look at the welded repairs to see if they could be satisfactory. We'll ask for documentation to support the welds because the code doesn't say you can't weld. They just really pull you through a keyhole for you to meet the requirements. I mean, what was the weld performed by a certified welder? Was the area prepped um, um, the right way? Was the weld then inspected by a professional engineer and they signed off that the weld was indeed satisfactory? All those things have to be looked after before a welded repair can be done. And look, it just goes without saying when you apply a significant amount of heat to a piece of metal, you're changing the metal components of it, the properties of the metal, so it will behave differently. So we would strongly advise to avoid performing welded repairs uh, on your racking. So as part of the inspection that you're asking somebody to perform, there should be some degree of prioritization of the issues. I mean, they should be prioritized in a way to allow you to put emphasis and a plan around those things that are most egregious. So we happen to have 4 buckets that we use at Damotech. So starting from the left, the most severe of issues is the unload, where think about those pictures that I showed you earlier, where the upright's not even making contact with the slab anymore. That's an unload situation. That's where your inspector should be advising you to take that bay out of service and unload the pallets that are immediately adjacent to the upright to remove that stress from the damaged component. And then you kind of go to the right with the high priority issues. These are ones where an unload may not be necessary. Maybe you're removing the top pallets, just for the sake of making sure, but it would be something that you want to address ASAP. So not necessarily having to put the bay out of service, but you'll want to either repair or replace the component very quickly to ensure that another damage or other intrusion doesn't impact the damaged component. Moderate. This is where, it doesn't rise to the level of having to be done right away, so having to address the issue right away, but there should be a plan put in motion to address this at some point. In other words, if you have a crew that's mobilizing to perform some high priority repairs, can they go ahead and knock out some of those moderate issues as well? Maybe as part of your CapEx for the following year, you set some dollars aside to kind of take off some of these moderates, because it's just a matter of time before somebody re-impacts or something else happens to that component where it'll eventually progress to something worse. Then, of course, lastly, we have the low priority. And really, this is kind of one of those things where it's just meant to say that our engineer saw something Doesn't, necessarily impose any risk to you, but it means that we saw it. Keep a keen eye on it to make sure that that deformation doesn't get re-impacted once again, or it doesn't lead to something more serious. So here's some examples of some unloads. So I think no one's going to argue that these pictures, should cause folks to be concerned. So you have a damage like the one in the first picture there that blew upright. I mean, that is just crazy. And what's not obvious is that in many of these situations, these locations are still in service. In other words, they still have freight or pallets that are loaded on them, and so not a good thing. These have to be cordoned off. You put safety tape on these things to make sure that no one is using these locations. And the same with the next picture, that beam that was severely impacted. It's putting stress on the connectors. So you have a full pallet that's sitting there on top of it. Even though it's just a few feet off the ground, not a good thing. I mean, you don't want to have components damaged like that supporting any kind of weight whatsoever. High, so these are instances where the welds were simply not in keeping with what we would expect as a standard. So these are areas where the areas were not prepped accordingly. The welds clearly a little bit botched. So this is where we would want to ensure that these components are addressed right away. If you look to the pictures to the right, you have a pinched column. That's just from people loading in the freight. And at some point, these cold formed or roll formed uprights are the gauge is so thin that you barely look at it and it gets deformed. So we're seeing some of that there. And then, of course, the far right picture where a damaged brace, especially a diagonal brace at the first panel, very important because a lot of that stress gets translated down to the bottom panel. So that got impacted significantly, and we'll want to put a fix in place to address that. Moderate, just some small, moderate deformations to the side of the upright. Maybe we're missing some anchors like in the middle picture, or missing a safety pin. Safety pins are required by code. They're a good redundancy to ensure that should, somebody operating a pallet or forklift and inadvertently lift the pallet too high, which could cause the beam to dislodge. We want the safety pin to allow for that to catch and not allow for that beam to dislodge itself completely. And of course the lows, maybe I've got safety bars, but they're not fixed. We don't want the safety bars to move around left to right. Those really should be secured in accordance with the OEM's recommendations. Maybe I have a loose anchor. I just need to tighten a little bit, or a small deformation to the brace like we're seeing on the far right. What's also kind of good to note is that, several low or moderate issues can add up to something that's high. And only a trained professional will be able to tell you whether those issues are significant enough. Is there a slight twist to the upright? Is there a minor deformation to the brace? And then all those things, it's almost like paper cuts, right? After a certain amount of time, you add all these things up and they're weakening the overall system. And a trained professional will be able to tell you whether those should be of concern or not. Now, as you perform your inspections, I mean, don't go crazy on trying to inspect, 40 items like we do. You really want to just stick to the very basics. We happen to have a great checklist that you can navigate to on our website. The URL is there on the slide. And really, we kind of just go to those vital things that could help out. We also have, as part of our platform, a self-inspection feature that could help guide you through these things. But very clearly, I mean, we're looking for some very, very key things. I'm a big proponent of the KISS principle, so kind of keeping it simple. Looking at upright columns, damage to braces, anything obvious going on with the beams. Are your uprights anchored in accordance with what the load capacity documentation says? Because in some cases, your rack design may only call for one anchor and you're good to go. but you could be in a seismic environment and maybe a minimum of 2 anchors is required or 4 anchors is required. Whatever those engineering documents say is what you should be following. Are there beam connectors in good condition? Are they still well seated? Are there any local repairs, the welded stuff that I showed you earlier? Do you have placards or labels for your load capacities? Is your racking plumb or not? Take a bubble level or torpedo level to see whether the racking is plumb in accordance with what the allowable standards are, and then start rating these. If you go through the appropriate training to perform these inspections on your own, you'll be able to come out of that really being able to identify those most critical issues that could kind of keep things, that can kind of make things unsafe. And again, that URL right there for those that want to download the checklist. As we keep on going, you'll want to retain an inspection history. And I say that only because it's good for benchmarking. It's good to show that potential OSHA inspector that you have been staying on top of things. And not only that, but to make sure that you're not only staying on top, but you're ticking off those issues and making sure that they've been addressed. And that'll be part of one of the must-dos we'll talk about here in a second. So in terms of some of the next steps you have, make sure that the experts that you work with as part of this first must do help you identify those high priority issues, that you understand the level of risk, that those recommendations come from experts, and that of course you avoid any unnecessary downtime as a result of having those positions put out of service. So must do number 2, take charge of safety with a solid action plan. So now that you've done the right thing, you've hired an expert to come in once a year, maybe you're performing your own self-assessments, on a monthly or more frequent basis. Make sure that whatever product or deliverable you get from that expert allows you to understand the critical things you want to go after, so that not everybody's got unlimited funds. You'll want to spend those funds wisely, but you want to be timely in how you address the issues that are reported back to you. So as part of those findings, you'll want to have something that's very detailed. It should be stamped. Maybe you have Excel files that allow you to see the images that were loaded. Maybe like us, we have an interactive layout that we build out and that we develop for each inspection that's accessible through our web-based platform. And of course, I keep on coming back, but that expert should be able to whittle down the vital few things you want to focus on first to ensure that those critical areas are taken care of. And of course, to the extent that load capacity was part of the scope, you'll want to ensure that you get that information as well. We talked about priorities. You should want to ensure at a very minimum that you understand what it is you want to focus on. So all of your issues should indeed be prioritized so that you could, again, focus right away on the things that matter the most. And then, of course, we want to be mindful that rack damage equates to unusable bays. So if you are a big box kind of store, or you have multiple DCs that service the food and beverage industry, rack damage can be very significant. And if you think about, the situation that we have on the screen where you've got 5 beam levels, and you have rack damage and that bay is put out of service, the amount of idle storage space that you now have, you're increasing the bottlenecks that could be present. There's a labor disruption because of the impact of having to address the situation. And most undoubtedly, there's a potential loss of revenue. If you're a 3PL and you rent out space to, customer XYZ, and he's paying to store goods at your facility, and you've got 10% of your locations that are out of service, that's money that's just not coming, that's not flowing to you. So all those things lead to not only unsafe conditions, but a potential hit to the bottom line. So you'll want to develop a plan to fix critical issues ASAP. So you'll want to look at repairing or replacing and understanding which approach is the best for the situation that you are in. So things you want to consider as you debate between replacing a component or repairing it. Think about the manufacturing cycle time because both options have, different approaches. The unloading that might be required, the installation time frame, and the complexity of the installation should be a factor. Uh, the prospect of future damage, are you just replacing a component with the same component just to see it be as fragile or as susceptible to future impact as you had before? Maybe think about approaching that equation differently. And of course, consider engineered solutions as a consideration. Component replacement, if you are going to go down the road of replacing damaged components, they've got to be like for like. So if you've got, bolted racking like we see in the picture, the blue racking there, you'll want to make sure that you're replacing those components like for like. Same gauge, same height, same dimensions, same everything. Not because you damaged a 96-inch beam that you could just take a 96-inch beam from your stock and just slap it in. It's got to have the same gauge of steel, the same profile, height, depth, because they're just not going to behave the same way. And it's happened before where customers of ours, one in particular, in the retail environment, having several retail stores throughout the US, they had a presence in Mexico and they repatriated a bunch of those uprights after those Mexican stores were closed. And they thought the racking was the same. They looked to be the same. They had the same dimensions. They had the same color, had the same hole punch, only to realize that the racking's gauge was 30% less than what they was supposed to be. So they started loading up those uprights with the same amount of weight, and lo and behold, one day, in the dead of night, the rack collapsed. It kind of did that little S curve in the upright, and they wouldn't have known otherwise, but they thought they were safe with an upright that seemed to be the same, and it just wasn't. So we want to make sure that we're like for like in every instance. But as you think about replacing racks, and I'm not saying that every component can be repaired, but think about, once you damage an upright and you replace it because you're doing the right thing, it's just a matter of time before that same upright gets re-damaged again, and you're just going through this cycle over and over and over again, which I think we just have to face costs time and it costs money to perform this inevitable cycle that we're in when we start replacing damaged uprights time and time again. Column repair, rack repair, as it's commonly known, is an interesting, I would say, alternative, but you want to make sure that it does what it's supposed to, that you pick the right vendor that has an engineered solution that restores the load capacity of the location that you're repairing, that it maintains the original configuration, that it's bolted as opposed to field welded or some other form of field prep, and of course that it minimizes the impact to operation. These are all things that you should keep in mind as you pick a potential vendor to perform rack repair at your site. A quick comparison between replacing an upright and repairing it with an engineered solution. Of course, on the rack repair side, at least at Damotech, you're in that 4-week time frame, and sometimes less in terms of manufacturing cycle time. Compare that to an upright replacement. So unless you have those in stock, or unless the OEM happens to have those, in their yard, you're going to be several times multiple longer for the delivery of that. Think about the situation that I showed you a couple of slides ago, where you've got 5 beam levels. The amount of time to remove the freight, to unclip all the beams, swap out the upright, versus, if it's done the right way with the right engineered solution, you'll have a minimal unloading required for rack repair. Installation, look, it's hours to swap out an upright, but it's minutes when it comes time for rack repair. A 24-inch kit, which is the one that you see on the far right side of the slide, takes anywhere between 20 to 30 minutes to repair. So think about how that impacts your operations and the pros and cons of both of those. And then finally, of course, on the rack repair side, especially with the Pro line, which is the orange kit that you see there, that has a built-in protection. It's guaranteed for life against impact. And coming back to what I showed in the very beginning of the presentation, uprights are just not meant to be impacted. So it's a matter of time before those uprights get re-impacted and we get into that awful cycle that we were talking about. Now, if you had a competent inspector come in and perform an assessment for you, they'll want to talk about protection solutions, not from a vendor standpoint, but just from an overall, hey, by the way, we noticed a trend that certain parts of your systems were getting impacted on a frequent basis. Maybe it was the ends of aisles, maybe it's certain tighter aisles, whatever the case may be, you'll want to ensure that you are made aware of the solutions that might be available to you to protect people, infrastructure, assets, and inventory. So protecting people, this is not, has nothing to do with racking per se, at least on the first slide. If you have pedestrian traffic and you have pedestrian walkways and you have heavy lifting equipment, navigating, close to these things, you'll want to make sure you protect folks and that they're not at risk of being hurt by operating equipment. If you're in a tunnel and you don't have wire mesh decking over the beams there, because you will not want product to fall on people either walking under the tunnel or navigating through with equipment. So make sure you do put decking in the tunnel areas. And I mentioned a few slides ago, if you have a section of racking where on one side you have pedestrian traffic, you'll want to put netting to make sure that the product doesn't inadvertently fall and hurt somebody. Again, not having to do with racking, but you have building infrastructure. So you have building columns that often get impacted. I tell you, you are not having a good day if you can see daylight through an I-beam. And I would tell you the cost of protection of a building column may seem high, especially if it's the right protector, like we see in the left-hand picture. But think about the pain and dollars spent on trying to assess what's happening in the middle set of pictures there, whether it's damaged concrete or it's that forklift blade that went through the I-beam. Again, not having a good day, that has to be assessed, has to be fixed, and then has to be signed off by a PE. So we're talking tens of thousands of dollars to effect a repair on something like that. Whereas you could have spent a few hundred, maybe $1,000 on the right protector and the right protection solution, you wouldn't have to face that. Then, of course, if you have other infrastructure like machinery, you'll want to protect that as well, because millions of dollars go into some of these machines, whether it's bottling or some other food service machinery. Those have to be protected adequately. And I would say, racking, look, racking is an asset. It is not just a commodity. The sooner we start thinking about racking as being an asset that supports things that then get distributed, the sooner we'll start treating it like an asset and protecting it accordingly. So some resources that you're happy to QR code if you're looking to understand the practical guides to inspections and the like. These are things that you'll want to look at readily, and obviously we have tons of content on our website. So we're down to the must-do number 3, which to me is one of the more important ones. After you've taken a look at all the information from the inspection report and you have a list of issues that have been prioritized and you understand what to go after, how do you ensure that it's actually taking place? How do you ensure that you're really addressing these issues over time? The last thing you want is to have somebody come in on February 1st of a given year, and then fast forward 6 months and those issues are still present. So you'll want to ensure that there's accountability and a way to monitor that progress. Again, not to tout Damotech, but we do, as part of our inspection and load capacity offering, having a web-based portal where you could navigate through the issues that we find and be able to address those real time and check those off, as the weeks and months progress. So our dashboard, again, it's real time. It shows you the state of affairs with your racking, kind of a health check. It provides a heat map analysis of all the issues that were there, all color coded to ensure that it is very clear to those that are in charge and those that are be acting on some of these issues what the priorities should be. And of course, for load capacity is the same way. If we, as part of our assessment, we see, load capacity levels that are under what we think it should be, we'll highlight those, and so you'll be able to have a look and understand why there may be a concern with load capacities. So as you track and report, what are you trying to track? Well, of course, making sure that you're staying on top of your load capacity. To the extent you've made a change to the beam levels, you'll want to ensure that you have a professional reassess that particular upright to make sure it's done correctly. Inspection reports, that those are logged, that all the issues, that if there are modifications or repairs, that those are addressed and you're keeping track of those. And of course, to the extent that you have self-inspection training that's taking place, you'll be able to store all those things, in our platform or elsewhere, but have access to those key documents. So again, very vital to ensure that as part of the effort that you have a control mechanism in place to ensure that the issues that were identified are in fact being taken care of over time. So must do number 4, this is where, we kind of ensure that everybody is invited to the party. So we want to train and empower the staff. So the benefits of safety education are, first and foremost, we're reducing injuries. If people are made aware of the things to avoid, again, less likely to have issues down the road. It'll reduce maintenance costs because then we'll understand the impact of some of the damage that's taken place. We'll clearly reduce liability. We're going to extend the life of the racks because, again, racks are not meant to be run into. And we're going to increase productivity because we're not going to have as many bays that are out of service. The key being empowering others. Employee training should be very thoughtful. Being told to be safe is simply not enough. Better behavior comes with awareness of what the code says, what the regulations might say. Maybe it's corporate guidelines that people just aren't in tune with. The ability to recognize those risks, understanding the consequences of some of these things being ignored. Complacency is not the right behavior as we think about consequences and damage to racking or an unclipped beam or a missing safety pin. Understanding the consequence of those particular high priority issues is an important great step. And of course, and I keep on using the word empowering, if people have a sense of ownership, I mean, we have best practices where they will assign a certain someone with their picture on the racking at the beginning of the aisle where you might have a load capacity display. They'll have that, hey, Joe is responsible for this section of racking. And that way you have a sense of ownership and a sense that somebody's looking after, those particular assets. Culture impacts safety, which is probably one of the greatest takeaways that we could take from this particular side. Employee training. So who is it for? Ask me, it's got to be a top-down approach. We can't just have the worker bees on the warehouse floor be the only ones that are made aware of the importance of rack safety. Senior management has to understand, because oftentimes if there's money that has to be freed up to pay or to hire more people, it's going to come from senior management. Managers at the middle level should also be made aware of these things so they could be the local presence to ensure that things are running the way they're supposed to. So whether it's a safety manager, ops, or even maintenance, they have to understand, the aspects of rack safety that could get people in trouble. And finally, I would say, as I would advocate for forklift operators to be trained to some extent, so they understand as they impact racking, that there is a consequence, that this could lead to really bad things happening over time. So what kind of things are covered? I know we perform a lot of training with our customers, rack components and the key terminology, so that we all start talking the same lingo, so we understand what components are and how they should be called out, the risks and damages, the prevention of these kind of things, forklift traffic, pedestrian safety, inspection best practices, and of course, we've talked about it already, repair and protection solutions to address these things and maybe prevent them from happening to begin with. Now, this is a video. I don't think the sound is going to come out, but hopefully it is. This is why we work safe, right? When it all comes down to it, we're working for, the brother or sister next to us. We're making sure that they get to go home at night, that they get to see their friends and families and their loved ones at the end of their shift. So put safety first always. So we're rounding things out now. So must do number 5 as a conclusion. If you think about all the things that we've talked about in these 4 must do's, it's a lot. It's a lot to kind of take in, and it's a lot to try to navigate. So it's okay to seek the help from a trusted expert. Someone that's going to be able to explain the racking design codes, that'll be able to kind of whittle it down to those must few things that are important. Whether it's in the USA or Canada, the codes are slightly different, but they're all based on the same fundamentals. But you want an expert that can help you understand the things that apply to you. Ultimately, rack damage, impacts load capacity. As you have impacts, the load capacity will change. To what extent, we don't know, but you can't expect that damage racking, like in the pictures we have there, will cause things to remain the same. You have to understand load capacity. You have to be able to post it. The code says so. It's very binary. It's black and white. The building code says you have to have load capacities displayed, and they have to be accurate. That ensures safer warehouse operations. You're complying with the regulations and codes, and of course, an operational efficiency, because folks aren't wondering whether the rack can support a certain amount of weight or not. Display the capacities and understand, and I briefly touched upon this, moving beam levels changes the capacity. Here's a great example where I have 4,500 pounds per pallet. I move that first beam level up 12 inches. I lose 33% of my capacity. I'm not making these numbers up. This was calculated. You simply cannot go around changing beam levels without having it looked after by an engineer. Overloading racks can lead to failure. So here's an instance where we overloaded the rack, and of course we had a little bit of shaking going on, did not behave the way it was supposed to. Again, it's difficult to watch, but certain small things can have very, very important consequences. So why partner with a third-party expert? It's about having knowledge, expertise, understanding, and standardizing across multiple locations. You don't want one vendor to look at things in Florida differently than somebody who's maybe working out of Oklahoma. Try to standardize this with a partner that can handle the geographic breadth of your operations. Have someone that has streamlined processes, that has the deep bench of knowledge to answer tough questions, that can respond quickly to your needs, and that, of course, has a compliance assurance to ensure that they can stand behind what it is that they're putting out there. Rack safety is an ongoing process. It doesn't stop with this presentation. It has to continue. Go to our website and look at the blogs, because OSHA is still there. We don't bring up OSHA to scare people, but OSHA's national emphasis program is there. It's there to stay, and they will continue coming. You don't know when, but they mean right. But I just want to say that staying on top of these things is going to go a long way. Some of the best practices, let's recap them. So conducting regular rack inspections, staying on top of safety with an action plan for those critical items, track the closure, the safety, the performance items to make sure they actually get done. train and empower your employees to understand when there's something bad that's happening so they can call it out themselves. And of course, don't be shy about calling on experts and engineers to help you navigate through some of these tough things. We put together a flywheel that helps that helps address this in a much more fulsome way. I would encourage you all to go have a look at it, but it really goes above and beyond the 5 steps that I just outlined today. Here's a QR code for all of the resources that we have. Then there's a QR code for the flywheel itself. Again, it's a great tool. It's a great way to explain rack safety to management and folks that are still wondering how to best attack this kind of stuff. So ultimately, closing comments, we're here to help. We've been around now for going on 36 years. We've been a trusted rack safety partner to a number of great companies. We have engineering expertise, a very deep bench of experts, safety products to help you address your concerns, and of course the noteworthy Damotech platform that helps you manage and look after your rack assets in a way that's intuitive and that can be shared across your network. With 35 years, as I mentioned, of rack safety, every year we perform north of 2,000 inspections, 125 million square feet per year. That's a huge amount of information, a huge amount of knowledge. We are experts in this field, and we're hoping that we could help some of you, make your way through some of the difficulties that you may face. So I know we may have time for Q&A, a couple minutes. I want to be mindful of people's time. Charles, are there some questions that came up that we could discuss?
Hi,
I don't
Mark.
know. Hey.
Yeah, so we got to answer just about all questions while you were talking. We could go perhaps in some of them. I do have one from Scott here asking, will this QA session be included in the recording? And yes, it will. And some of the answered questions, I'll just go to the very top. It was quite popular, 13 answered questions. So the OSHA people, if the OSHA people ever come in and ask for documentation, what exactly do they want? What is it that they need typically? So I did answer, but I might ask you, do you have any points that you could add to this?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think, and we mentioned it a little bit before, load capacity documentation is probably the most important one, aside from having to be able to demonstrate that there's a plan in place for looking after the rack, whether it's that you hire a third party to come in on a regular basis, or they have your own self-inspection program. If you've been through a Damotech self-inspection training, you'll have certifications to attest to those attendees having been trained to perform self-inspections. So those are kind of things that, in my experience in talking with OSHA inspectors, that they like to see. Once they see that you're in control, that there's a comfort with your rack safety elements, they typically tend to walk the other direction and leave you alone.
Yep, I agree. And also think about your insurance company. If they know that things are in control, they feel everything is safe.
Absolutely.
Another question, should I have my racks repaired before having them inspected? And so that was a tricky one.
Yeah, and it's kind of a chicken and egg thing. Certainly if you've got damaged racking, fixing it is not wrong. But I would tell you sometimes it might be better to understand the overall context of things, the extent of the damage or the issues that you might face so that you're utilizing your third party in an efficient fashion. But I would say for sure, if you've got 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 really damaged uprights that you want to have repaired right away because they're impacting your operations, nothing bad to say about repairing those right away. I would just say
Yeah.
sometimes taking a step back to understand the broader context might be something worth considering.
Yeah, and that's all in the context where we're thinking that you are already in control. You have your documentation about the rack, but If you don't have the documentation about the rack, that's where we're saying, oh yeah, you should have somebody come in and check it. Because what if you make some repairs, but you don't even have enough load capacity according to the design standards? So that's something to consider for sure.
Good. All right, so I think we're at a couple minutes past the top of the hour, so we'll go ahead, I think, adjourn things. Thank you, Charles, our chief engineer, for taking part in our in today's webinar and answering some of those key questions. And I'm hoping folks kind of came away after today's presentation with some keen understanding and some best practices to apply to your immediate situation. We're just a phone call away. Feel free to visit us at damotech.com and submit a query or reach out directly. We're happy to help, and I thank you all for taking some time during your busy day to listen to what we have to say. Have a great rest of your afternoon or a great rest of your day, and we'll stay in touch. Thanks, everybody.